15,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, his bomber was crippled and burning. A Japanese Zero fighter was closing in for the kill shot. Lieutenant Owen Baggett had no guns, no weapons, nothing left to fight with, except the .45 caliber pistol on his hip. What happened next defied every law of aerial combat and became one of the most legendary stories in Air Force history. The only problem? For decades, nobody could prove it actually happened. It was January 1943, and the war in the Pacific was brutal. American bomber crews were flying missions over Japanese-held Burma, facing swarms of enemy fighters with minimal escort protection. The life expectancy of a B-24 Liberator crew wasn't measured in years or even months. It was measured in missions. If you survived 20, you were lucky. If you survived 30, you were a miracle. Owen Baggett was a second lieutenant from Texas, 24 years old, with a crop of dark hair and the kind of quiet confidence that made other men trust him. He'd wanted to be a pilot since he was a kid, watching barnstormers perform at county fairs. When the war came, he enlisted immediately, earned his wings, and found himself assigned to the 7th Bombardment Group in India. The B-24 Liberator was a beast of an airplane, 4 engines, long range, heavy payload. But it was also slow, difficult to maneuver, and vulnerable to fighter attack. The crews called it the flying coffin, for good reason. When Japanese Zeros came calling, there wasn't much you could do except hope your gunners were accurate and pray your luck held. On March 31, 1943, Baggett's luck ran out. His B-24 was part of a formation bombing Japanese positions near Pyongyang in Burma. The mission started badly. They lost their fighter escort early, and Japanese intelligence had apparently known they were coming. Before they reached the target, Zeros swarmed them like angry hornets. The air exploded with tracer fire and cannon shells. One by one, B-24s started falling from the sky, trailing smoke and flame. Baggett's plane took hit after hit. Engines caught fire. Hydraulics failed. The aircraft shuddered and began losing altitude. "Bail out!" the pilot screamed over the intercom. "Bail out now!" Baggett and his crew scrambled for the escape hatches. At 15,000 feet, the air was thin and freezing. He grabbed his parachute, clipped it on, and jumped into empty space. The sensation of freefall is something you never forget. The wind roaring past your ears, the ground impossibly far below, your stomach trying to crawl up through your throat. Baggett pulled his ripcord, felt the violent jerk as the parachute deployed, and suddenly he was floating, drifting down toward the Burmese jungle. That's when he saw them. Japanese Zeros were circling the descending parachutes like sharks around wounded fish. And they were shooting. This wasn't uncommon. Despite international agreements about not firing on helpless parachutists, both sides sometimes did it. The Japanese pilots had just watched their positions get bombed. They were angry, and here were the bombers' crews, hanging defenseless in the sky. Baggett watched in horror as Zeros made strafing runs on his fellow crewmen. Parachutes collapsed. Bodies fell. Men he'd eaten breakfast with that morning were being murdered in midair, and there was nothing he could do. Except there was one thing. Baggett reached down and pulled out his M19 11.45 caliber pistol. Every airman carried one, standard issue survival gear. It was meant for defense on the ground if you were shot down behind enemy lines. Nobody in their right mind thought you could use it in the air. But Owen Baggett wasn't thinking rationally anymore. He was angry, terrified, and watching his friends die. And a Zero was heading straight for him. Now, let's be clear about how insane this situation was. Baggett was hanging from a parachute, swinging in the wind, at 15,000 feet. The Zero was traveling at roughly 300 miles per hour. He had a pistol, a weapon designed for close-range combat, with an effective range of maybe 50 yards under ideal conditions. The odds of hitting anything were astronomical. The odds of causing any damage to an armored fighter plane were essentially zero. But Baggett had a plan, and it was either brilliant or completely crazy. He played dead. As the Zero approached, Baggett went limp in his parachute harness, head down, arms dangling. The Japanese pilot would see what looked like a corpse and might fly close to confirm the kill. That was Baggett's only chance. The Zero came in, guns silent. The pilot was curious, cautious, making sure the American was actually dead before moving on to the next target. He flew closer. Closer. Baggett could see the red circles on the wings. Could see the pilot's face through the canopy. The Zero was maybe 30 feet away, slowing down to get a better look. That's when Baggett snapped into action. He raised his pistol and fired 4 shots, as fast as he could pull the trigger. Bang, 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 bang. The Zero jerked, rolled, and began to smoke. It spiraled away, losing altitude, and crashed into the jungle below. Baggett had just done the impossible. He'd shot down a Japanese fighter plane with a pistol while hanging from a parachute at 15,000 feet. Or had he? See, here's where the story gets complicated. Baggett landed in the jungle, was immediately captured by Japanese forces, and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. When he finally came home in 1945, he told his story. And nobody really believed him. Oh, they were polite about it. Sure. Owen. You shot down a Zero with your pistol. That's a hell of a story. But privately, people figured he'd gotten confused, traumatized, maybe imagined the whole thing in the chaos of combat. After all, there was no wreckage, no confirmation, no witnesses who survived. For decades, it remained just a story, one of those too good to be true tales that gets told in bars and passed down through generations of pilots. The military never officially credited Baggett with the kill. His service record mentioned he'd been shot down and captured, but nothing about taking out a Zero with his sidearm. Baggett went home to Texas, got married, had kids, lived a quiet life. He didn't talk much about the war. When he did mention the pistol incident, it was usually met with skeptical smiles and polite nods. Then, in the 1980s, something interesting happened. Military historians started going through Japanese records that had been captured at the end of the war. And buried in those documents, they found something remarkable. A report of a Zero fighter that crashed on March 31, 1943, near Piemonte. The pilot had been killed. The official cause? Head wound from a bullet. Not cannon fire. Not machine gun damage. A single bullet. To the head. The report didn't specify whose bullet, of course. But the timing, location, and circumstances all matched Baggett's story perfectly. A Zero had crashed exactly where and when Baggett said it did, with the pilot killed by a single gunshot wound. Could it have been ground fire? Possible but unlikely. The plane was at high altitude. Could it have been from another aircraft? The B-24s were all destroyed or fleeing, and American fighters weren't in the area. The most logical explanation, as improbable as it sounds, was that Owen Baggett had actually done it. He'd fired 4 shots. One of them, just one, had somehow impossibly found its mark. It had passed through the canopy, struck the Japanese pilot in the head, and killed him instantly. The Zero, with its pilot dead at the controls, had simply fallen from the sky. The odds of this happening are so minuscule that mathematicians would probably tell you it was statistically impossible. But sometimes, in war, the impossible happens. By the time this evidence surfaced, Baggett was an old man. The Air Force still didn't officially credit him with the kill. There were bureaucratic reasons, rules about confirmations and witnesses. But among military historians and aviation enthusiasts, his story became legend. Think about what had to go right for this to work. Baggett had to stay calm while falling through the sky with enemy fighters circling. He had to have the presence of mind to play dead convincingly. The Japanese pilot had to be curious enough to fly close. Baggett had to time his shots perfectly, compensating for his own swinging motion, the wind, the speed of the aircraft, and the fact that he was doing all this at 15,000 feet with frozen fingers and racing adrenaline. And then one bullet, just 1 out of 4, had to travel through the air, penetrate the canopy at exactly the right angle, and strike the pilot in a lethal spot. It's the kind of shot you couldn't make again if you tried 1,000 times. It was luck, skill, desperation, and sheer audacity all combined into one impossible moment. Baggett spent 2 years in Japanese POW camps. The conditions were brutal: starvation, disease, abuse. Many men didn't survive. But Baggett did, and when the war ended, he came home to a hero's welcome, though not for the reasons everyone thought. He died in 2006 at the age of 85. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, his time as a POW, and yes, the story about shooting down a Zero with his pistol. By then, enough evidence had accumulated that people no longer dismissed it as fantasy. Today, aviation historians consider it one of the most remarkable individual actions in the history of aerial combat. Not because it was strategic or changed the course of the war, it didn't. But because it represents something important about human nature under extreme pressure. When everything goes wrong, when you're falling through the sky watching your friends die, when logic says you have no chance, sometimes, you still fight back. You pull out your pistol and take your shot, even though every rational part of your brain knows it won't work. And sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible happens. Owen Baggett's story reminds us that war is full of moments that defy explanation. Moments of incredible luck, unbelievable courage, and outcomes that shouldn't have been possible. His .45 caliber pistol is probably rusting in a Burmese jungle somewhere, but the legend of what he did with it lives on. The next time someone tells you something is impossible, remember the Texas pilot who shot down a Japanese fighter plane with his sidearm while dangling from a parachute at 3 miles up. Remember that he took 4 shots in the worst possible conditions and somehow, impossibly, one of them counted. In the insanity of war, sometimes the craziest plan is the one that works.